Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Set and Setting podcast. We have with us today Andrew DeAngelo. Andrew is a cannabis industry consultant and strategic advisor. He's also a visionary leader with a proven track record of enacting systemic social change and developing best practices in cannabis. Co-founder of Harborside and Last Prisoner Project, DeAngelo has been an activist for over 2 decades, pioneering legal cannabis. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you today, Madison. Thank you.
So let's just start with how'd you get into cannabis? How'd you get into activism? Like, what's your background story here?
Well, your listeners may be more familiar with my older brother, Steve DeAngelo. Steve's about 10 years older than me. And as all of us that appreciate psychedelics can understand, it's good to have a guide. It's good to have a guide when you're getting into cannabis or visionary plants. I was very lucky. My brother Steve was already a cannabis activist, was already pretty well known in the cannabis community by the time I was 15 or 16, and sort of became old enough to start being introduced to these compounds myself. So like most kids in high school, I was depressed and couldn't really find my identity and felt very lost. And I got passed around between my divorced parents. So I was always starting a new school. And it was really hard for me to find a circle of friends that I could be with in high school. So I was kind of bummed out. And my brother, I was at my mom's house one night having family dinner. And it was a pretty good setting for me to start smoking weed. So my brother handed me a joint and I decided to take it at that moment. And I immediately felt the benefits of cannabis, a lot of my psychic pain in particular, but also some of my physical pain. I was an athlete at the time, so I had some physical pain, went away, and a whole new, many new doors of perception opened in my mind. And at that, pretty right away after taking that first experience of cannabis, I decided I was going to take cannabis every day of my life. I was going to trade in cannabis. I was going to try to make cannabis legal. I was going to want to get cannabis in the hands of as many people as I could. I knew the plant was smarter than me. And what it had done to me, I just wanted it to do to other people. And so being a trader, I thought was the best way to do that. And of course, in those days, in the 1980s, being a trader was dangerous from a legal perspective. And so that's why we were motivated to change the laws and make things legal. And all I can say is be careful what you wish for. And I think that, what we learned from making cannabis legal, particularly the hard lessons, I hope we can pass on to the psychedelic community, and so that community can avoid some of the mistakes we made.
Mm-hmm. And just so we mentioned in your bio, Harborside and Last Prisoner Project. So could you just kind of go over what those two things are for the audience if they don't already know?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Harborside was one of the first licensed cannabis dispensaries on earth. So the city of Oakland, California legalized medical in 1996. But the state legislature was too afraid to regulate. And actually, that was a blessing in disguise, because even though growers and no one had a license and we didn't have any rules to operate under, we also didn't have bad rules to operate under and bad tax formats to operate under and bad frameworks to operate under. So we were able to police ourselves really well. And the city of Oakland got a little fed up with all these dispensaries opening up all over the place and sort of causing problems in the neighborhoods in some cases, and people not behaving so well in other cases. And so they decided to shut them all down and issue licenses and regulate that part of the supply chain, dispensaries only. And so they were going to issue 4 licenses, just 4 licenses. And my brother and I saw that as our golden opportunity to get legal after a long time of not being legal and getting busted and losing everything. So we decided to go for one of those 4 licenses. We got the license and we opened Harborside a year or so after getting the license. It took a while to open, as everyone knows who does this. And our business model, our vision, the idea we had for a new kind of dispensary ended up being something that really resonated with patients and resonated with customers. And, within a year or two, we were seeing 700, 800, 1,000 patients a day and doing a lot of media and inviting a lot of the world in to see how we were doing it in the hopes that we could sort of make people courageous enough to do it themselves in their town, in their state, and sort of inspire more activism like we had done in California in 1996. Mm-hmm. So that's Harborside. I was with Harborside for almost 15 years. We for lots of reasons, some of them good, a lot of them bad. We took the company public. We exited. My brother and I exited the company. And now I have a new career as a consultant, and I help other people start their cannabis companies or other visionary plant enterprises and sort of, carry on my work in that way. I'm a little burnt out on owning and operating companies after 15 years with Harborside. I imagine I probably will do that again soon, but right now I'm having a pretty good time helping other folks, launch their dreams.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned the Last Prisoner Project.
Yeah, sorry. Last Prisoner Project. Last Prisoner Project, right after I left Harborside, I wanted to do something less transactional. Mm-hmm. When you take a company public, it's just like you're in meetings with investment bankers and very transactional people, a lot of lawyers for many, many months. And it grinded on my soul and made me feel like, oh my gosh, capitalism really is an evil, terrible thing. And so I wanted to do something that's nonprofit oriented. I wanted to do something that was completely service oriented. We asked ourselves, who are the most vulnerable in our community? And can we help them? And who is helping them? And what we learned is that cannabis prisoners are the most vulnerable people in our community. They're still locked up for something that's basically not a crime anymore in most places in this country where most people live in this country. And it's a travesty of justice that these folks are still locked up. And there are a few groups helping with expungement, or there are a few groups helping with, getting these folks some relief by donating money in their commissary accounts. But there was nobody actively working to get them out of prison and actively working to do the hard work of things like clemency petitions and, re-entry to society once you do get people out. And there was a real need for that in the sort of nonprofit service of our community. Mm-hmm. And so we started Last Prisoner Project with that in mind. We're very narrowly focused. We don't help psychedelic prisoners. We don't help any other prisoners. We're just focused on cannabis prisoners. There certainly should be a version of LPP in the psychedelic community. We have a lot of brothers and sisters, a lot of indigenous folks locked up all over the world for these visionary plants, and we need to get them home too. But Last Prisoner Project strictly focused on cannabis prisoners. One of the things I've learned now that I'm sort of in the middle-aged portion of my career is that you can't do too many things at once. If you try to do too many things at once, you end up not focused enough to help as many people as perhaps you're motivated to help. So as a younger man, I did a lot of that sort of too wide a net. And I've learned over the years to really try to focus my attention on on a few big things I can do within any group, any organization. So that's Last Prisoner Project. People can go to our website, lastprisonerproject.org. Lots of different ways for individuals to plug in, lots of different ways for cannabis companies to plug in. I'm very proud to say the organization is growing rapidly, and we're getting people out of prison. And, we're achieving the goal. This year has been by far our best year getting people out of prison. I think we've gotten well over a dozen people out of prison, maybe more than that. And the work continues. We have, close to 40,000 cannabis prisoners in prison. And so I hope everyone will pitch in and help us bring them home. And I hope anyone listening who wants to be inspired to do the same thing in the psychedelic community, we'd certainly be happy to mentor and figure that out with everyone too.
So there was one thing that you said that I wanted to just expand on a little bit was, getting burnt out on sort of capitalism and, so much of what is a big debate in this cannabis and psychedelic world is like, is the spirit or nature of capitalism in accordance with like the essence of the values that you come to under the influence of these visionary plants, you say? So like, what do you think of that? Like, is it possible to really incorporate quote unquote conscious capitalism into the cannabis space or the psychedelic space, or is it kind of like an oxymoron?
Well, I think it's the other way around. I think that the psychedelic and cannabis space needs to transform capitalism into conscious capitalism or compassionate capitalism, if you will. Capitalism's not conscious right now. Just look at this latest environmental summit that happened in Glasgow. It was a joke. There was more people from the petroleum industry there than anywhere else. Any other country's delegation was smaller than the 500 people the petroleum industry sent. Talk about an industry that should be banned. It shouldn't be cannabis and psychedelics. It should be fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And we're all strung out on fossil fuels, you included, me included. And it's a disgrace. It's terrible. I have solar power on my roof. I drive an electric car. I still use natural gas in my house to heat the darn thing. And you feel terrible about this. And so capitalism is not aligned with the values of our plants and our plant medicine and what those plants teach us when we're tripping or when we're under the influence or when we're listening, when we're in a place where we're really, really listening to the plants. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're not in that place. We're just in a medicated place. I just need to calm down. I just need to get de-stressed. I just need to blow out something and get in touch with the life force again. But other times, when it's a little less frantic approach to the medicine and it's more deliberative and intentional, which I hope people will practice, you can really listen to these plants. And I hope, my prayer really is that us leaders, us in this community, us in this tribe will listen to the plants and the messages of the plants and try to influence capitalism, build some bridges into that, find our own Trojan horse to kind of crawl our way into the belly of capitalism and turn it into conscious capitalism. That, I think, is one of the big missions of our community. It's not getting capitalism to listen up. It's not, capitalism's not changed right now. So it's about getting capitalism to change. And that's one of our roles. And hopefully the plants can help.
What would that look like? Like what would capitalism look like if it were more conscious?
Well, I think that one of the big things two big things. One, greed would not be the only driving principle of every decision that is made. There would be a community part of that decision-making process. And if greed was hurting the community too much, you don't do whatever that thing is. Mm-hmm. You just don't do it. You say no. Like I read this article recently. There's a country in South America, Guyana, and they have some of the most pristine rainforests in the world because the rest of the world paid them not to cut down their rainforests. Well, ExxonMobil found a bunch of oil outside on their ocean, out in the shores of their ocean. They only get about, I don't know what it is, some tens of millions of dollars not to cut down the forest every year. Exxon's promising them that every quarter or every year. And this is a country that's worked pretty hard to be ecological and responsible. And now this greed, this unabashed greed is causing them to drill this oil, take this money, and it might make their country go under the water. It's a low-lying country, and they already have a seawall, and they've already had terrible floods that don't last like a week or two, that last like 4 months. And so we see that in that case, if we're just using that as an example, we would say, no, we don't drill for that oil. Greed is not the driving principle here. The driving principle is to protect the ecology of this country. So let's increase the amount of money we give to these folks to protect the forest and to protect the ecology and to make this country prosperous enough so they're not knocking on the door of big oil. Or accepting the deals from big oil when somebody finds oil reserves off the coast of the ocean. And Exxon also, I mean, conscious capitalism means Exxon doesn't even, it says, wow, we found all this oil that's going to screw this country. Guess what? We're not going to do that. And so how do you create that balance? It really comes from within, because the driving principle of greed is a really hard thing to disrupt. And that's what the plant medicine does. The reason I could be making a lot of money right now, I didn't have to exit Harborside and go start a nonprofit getting cannabis people out of prison. It's taken me an enormous amount of time, energy, and money to get that nonprofit up and started. I could have started another operating company. There's a whole bunch of investors that would have loved to invest in me and gone out and basically do Harborside 2.0 and make it even better and stronger the next time. I could have done all that, but it wasn't. It's not my value system. and taking my previous company public taught me a lot about what this means, and taught me a lot about what investment bankers are, and it taught me a lot about high-level investors and who they're all about. And in order to be a billionaire or to have that kind of success in the transactional economy, you have to change who you are. You have to change the essence of who you are. You have to make this greed the number one thing that drives you, no matter what, ruthlessly. Look at guys like Trump or, any of these, Bezos, even Musk, who, you got to love Musk in some ways, but it's just this, just driving. And if we could just take all that driving energy and we could put it into what the plants teach us, which is to love each other, ultimately, that the life force that propels all of this is love. And we can't destroy our ecology and love at the same time. Those are two opposing forces. So we have to stop destroying our ecology and find a way to tap into that love. The plant medicine plays a big role in that. And, it's like, we don't, and how we bring these plants into the hearts and minds of people is a tricky thing to figure out. It has to happen rapidly. It has to happen with millions and billions of people. We can't wait any longer. It has to be, and, to do something with these compounds that's wide and that fast, harms could occur, as a result of that. And so, but harms are occurring now as a lack of result of that. And so we're at a time of real precipice for all of us. And so, conscious capitalism has to happen from the inside out. I just don't see it happening from the outside in. I do think that putting pressure on capitalism from the outside in, like the Greta Thunbergs of the world and the young people nowadays, I think that's enormously important. The leaders that are older at Greenpeace and other organizations that have been doing this for a long time, that's really important too. But ultimately, it has to come from the inside. People who are driven to dominate the world have to be driven to love the world.
I love that. And I kind of like the order of this conversation because oftentimes I'll talk to people for this podcast and we'll talk about, like their spiritual practice and how psychedelics or cannabis kind of set them off. And then what do you do about it? And I feel like this is sort of the reverse where we're getting the action items first, right? Like the actual social justice put into practice that is informed by the spirituality that you learn from, to use the phrasing that you've used, these visionary plants. So, my question for you is like, I really love the term visionary plant. Usually people say plant medicine or whatever. So what are some of these kind of like visionary experiences that you've had? And is that just related to, like the organic plants themselves, or is that, can you get that from something like LSD or something synthetic? And I'm saying that specifically because I want to also segue into a little bit of a conversation about this concept of California sober that you and I have spoken about before.
Sure. Well, I've had a lot of experience in both the raw plant formulations of psychedelics and the synthetics. Frankly, I've had a lot of profound experiences with both. Remember, LSD comes from ergot plant, and a lot of these compounds do have their original source material are coming from plants. So, and a lot of it is who's synthesizing them and in what lab. Alexander Shulgin synthesized a bunch of really great compounds, several of which I've extensively experimented with, and just the amount of insights and transformative experiences I've had under those synthetics have been tremendous. Mm-hmm. I've also had just as profound, if not more profound, experiences under the pure plant medicines too. So I think there's a place in the psychedelic pharmacology, I guess you could call it, for both of those things. I think it is important that we understand what all of those things are, and that we're respecting each compound and understanding its effects and the set and settings we should create for them, and just where we need to be in our psychological journey, psychedelic journey to handle those compounds. You perhaps don't want to do a really intense ayahuasca trip in the middle of Peru as your very first experience. I could imagine some other experiences warming up to that might be beneficial. Some might argue, go for the major trip in Peru at first, and you'll get the real essence of it. Everyone will have probably their own way of going about doing that. But I think politically, the politics of this and the public policy of this and how we're going to get the natural compounds, I think, being decriminalized first. We're already seeing this with decrim. Here in Oakland, we have decrim of visionary plants, not just psilocybin, but all visionary plants are decrimmed here. We're seeing, I think Denver did the same thing, if I'm not mistaken, or did they just do
They just did psilocybin. So
just
yeah.
Psilocybin,
Yeah, it was just psilocybin in Denver County.
Yeah, all right. And then I think there was one other place, I think in Massachusetts or something like that just did psilocybin. So the plants are a little bit easier for the public to vote for mm-hmm. in a referendum or not to object to. But once you start saying LSD, all the baggage that LSD has from the 60s and all that kind of stuff, is still in the minds of the public, somewhat in the minds of pop culture. And so, politically, I think the plants itself. And then the other part of this is just the work that's being done by people like MAPS and others to create therapeutic formulations that actually get through the FDA process and to the point where someday soon, perhaps in the next several years, there'll be little trip clinics. I don't know where they're going to put these trip clinics because of the NIMBYism, but maybe on academic campuses or maybe in certain areas where people won't object to having a trip clinic in their neighborhood. I think that's going to be a whole nother political battle. But you'll have these trip clinics that people can get therapeutic trips in. We're seeing this with ketamine already. And I hope we'll have low cost and low entry models for that. So people of color and folks that aren't as privileged can also get access to these therapies. And, we're going to have to go about educating that community a lot differently. And certainly I'm not the guy to, educate that community exclusively, but that's a whole nother, the whole diversity part of this is similar to cannabis. We just have to do a good job making sure that these therapies don't become, exclusively for the privileged.
Well, I think that's kind of in line with the conversation we were having a little bit earlier about conscious capitalism, right? And I know you said you're in Oakland, and there's Sage Clinic in Oakland, which does ketamine therapy. And I think they've been a really great model for accessibility. If I'm not mistaken, they might have some sort of sliding scale option specifically so that people who can't otherwise afford ketamine therapy, which it could be $700 an infusion, are able to kind of get that medicine. But it is interesting too, like the ketamine clinics right now are providing a model for what psychedelic clinics could look like in the future. So, as a place where people go and are basically in a comfortable room and receive the medicine, and whether it's followed up or preceded by talk therapy, I guess varies. But, that kind of does seem to be the model that people are going toward. My question is, and you talked about again, like how, overall in the country, as we're seeing psychedelic decriminalization happen, for the most part, it's happening only for psychedelic plants and fungi, not so much for synthetics like MDMA or LSD, which kind of is in line with this idea of California sober, which, for the audience who doesn't necessarily know what that means, it's, people who don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but like who don't partake in alcohol or synthetic drugs, but, are pretty much okay with cannabis and other plant medicines. Is that the right definition?
Well, that's one definition. Some people who call themselves Cali sober do dabble in alcohol a little tiny bit here and there. But the main idea behind it is cannabis and psychedelics act as a substitute for these folks for alcohol and really hard drugs that many of them, not all of them, but many of them had trouble with in the past, or the rest of us don't want to get in trouble with them in the future.
Mm-hmm. And so where, this is something that you and I talked about before. So what is, like, why are you into this kind of, like, what inspires you about California sober, I guess, why is that something that you care about?
Yeah, well, I've been in alternative communities my entire career. I also come from a family of alcoholics on my mother's side. And I had to experience a lot of traumatic events because of that alcoholism. And then as I became a young cannabis dealer and artist and alternative person, I saw all these folks in our community either self-medicating with hard drugs because they're selling weed underground, or they're doing music, or they're doing things that are really hard that society says is bad and wrong, or they're running rainbow gatherings or facilitating Burning Man festivals. Whatever, and they get strung out. They would get strung out on hard drugs. They get strung out on alcohol because they were self-medicating. And I had to deal with this addiction all around me. And in some cases, it had a huge impact on me. People I was doing cannabis deals with that would get strung out, they'd get busted. I'd have to bail them out of jail. The money they owed me for the weed I fronted them was gone. The legal case had to be fought. And, it really damaged the scene that I'd created. Mm-hmm. And I was cleaning up all these messes. And I myself was not strung out or doing these things. I had a very strict exercise regimen, and I had other tools in my toolbox I learned from being an actor when I went to acting school that allowed me to stay away from this. And also the alcoholism in my family taught me to stay away from it, to just apply discipline and to stay away from it. So when I learned about Cali Sober a few years ago, in the 90s when we were working with this concept, we called it harm reduction. And the idea is don't smoke that crack pipe, smoke this joint instead. And that was the idea behind harm reduction. But it never really took hold. Harm reduction is still talked about a lot in recovery communities. It's still talked about somewhat in drug policy communities. But it never really took hold with the people. If you look at the opioid epidemic happening right now, 100,000 people OD'd. I'm watching that documentary. Well, it's a dramatic series called Dope Sick right now, all about the Slacker family and Purdue Pharma and what they did. And harm reduction just didn't work as a concept. So Cali Sober, when I learned about it a couple of years ago, and this is a term that really comes from younger generations of thinkers, people more from your generation that I met who are writers, and Michelle Luke and Jackie Bryant and some other folks like that. And, I was asked to write about Cali Sober for Playboy. I never heard of it. So I called up Michelle and I called up Jackie and I was like, what is this thing? And when they told me about it, I was like, oh, it's harm reduction. Oh my God, this has been around since the jazz age, since the beatniks. There's always been jazz musicians who smoked weed and didn't do the H or didn't do the booze, and they had longer careers. Or same thing with the beatniks, same things with the hippies. So I got really turned on by the idea because, oh wow, this term is a lot more interesting to me. Cali Sober is, and I know a lot of people have a hard time with it. Term, but I really like the term because it's something that I think it's a little more operational than harm reduction. It's a more appealing to people. We need to brand responsible intoxicant use in a fun way, and I think Cali Sober does that. And so I eagerly attached my caboose to the train, and I'm sort of the Gen Xer guy in the back cheering on everybody else who's driving the train up front. And I think it's something we should be talking about. I think that despite the controversy, there's some people in the recovery community that are really pissed off about Cali Sober and think we're doing harm and causing people to relapse and, behave badly. I hope that's not the case. But despite that, the traditional approach to sobriety and the 12 steps simply doesn't work for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I talked to numerous people that said, I just didn't feel at home in those 12-step circles. I tried, but I felt shame and I felt bad and I wanted to go smoke some weed afterwards. And then, there's all this pressure at the next meeting to admit the fact that you smoked some weed, and then all this shame, and you can't do that. And you're not allowed to do that. You're off the 12 steps. And so I think this may present a little bit of a different operating system for sobriety that people can embrace. The idea is not to become 100% sober. You're going to be taking cannabis now and again, maybe even every day. You're going to be taking psychedelics, certainly not every day. But now and again, maybe you won't take psychedelics. There's plenty of Cali Sober people that just take weed, don't take psychedelics. There's plenty of Cali Sober people that take psychedelics, don't take weed. But the idea is these compounds, psychedelics and cannabis, allow us to function at a high level in our lives, hold down a job, be good parents, be good sons, take care of our families, be in the community, and live productive and perhaps even more than productive lives without dying from our use of intoxicants, without getting strung out chemically strung out on our use of intoxicants. And certainly people can misuse cannabis, and certainly people can misuse MDMA. And, we have to educate people on what that looks and feels like and how to get help for that. Because we're kidding ourselves that in the psychedelic community, if we feel, or the Cali sober community, if we feel those things cannot be abused, they can be. But that's where our community has to come together and help each other and get people treatment so that they don't. There are some people who simply have to be sober people. They can't take cannabis. They can't take psychedelics. Whenever they get high on anything, it's a downward spiral, and they start taking all these other things, and they just have this hyper addictive personality. And for those folks, they need to embrace, meditation, exercise, prayer, travel, hiking, marathon running, whatever it is, to basically do the same thing Cali Sober does, and that is to set you on the course of a functional, productive, and fulfilling. That's the key word: fulfilling, meaningful life that makes you feel like you're free and not trapped inside an addiction that you can't get out of.
I mean, so I feel like this is bringing up so many ideas for me right now. I mean, number one is like when I look at anybody's relationship to a substance, whether it's alcohol or psychedelics or cannabis or cocaine or MDMA or whatever it is, my litmus test for is this working for you is your life functional, right? And Carl Hart talks about this. He's a neuroscientist at Columbia who wrote an amazing book, Druggies for Grownups. I recommend everyone here read it. But essentially he's come out of the closet about, doing quote unquote hard drugs, kind of having a functional, casual, non-obtrusive relationship even to things like heroin. So, and the question is, are you being a good parent? Are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? Are you fulfilling your responsibilities? Are you making money? Are you, is your life working for you? And I think, that is the ultimate question, and so again, in my conversations with Carl Hart, to just kind of play devil's advocate a little bit to the concept of Cali Sober is like this idea of psychedelic exceptionalism, right? Like, are certain drugs better than other drugs, right? Like, is cannabis better than heroin? Sure, like on a physiological level, like absolutely. It's not, you can't overdose from cannabis. But yeah, I guess, I really appreciate the way that you piece together Cali Sober with harm reduction, because that is really at the heart of it, is just like reducing harm and maximizing benefit, whatever your relationship is to the substances that you're talking about. So, the other thing that I wanted to kind of get at here was, and we spoke about this, I think, in our last interview, is that, the term Cali Sober, like why California, right? Like what image does that provoke? For me, I think of like people who live by the beach and smoke weed and do yoga, and like, is Cali Sober more than just a harm reduction tactic, or is it also a lifestyle? And does it, conjure up images of people who have like some sort of like spiritual aspect to their relationship with getting high or medicating?
Well, first, I'll just say I really love Carl's work. I think it's really important. Yes, I guess there is a trap of psychedelic and cannabis exceptionalism. I think maybe we need to step on that path of exceptionalism to kind of walk a bridge to the place where he's at. He's in a very utopian adult place and he assumes that everybody is as smart and well-disciplined as he is. And that's simply not the case. If we all were, then yeah, absolutely, man. No exceptionalism whatsoever. Make sure these formulations are available and they're safe. And if you want to do heroin when you're done at night, and you can fulfill this checklist of being a responsible, functional person, then hey, it's your consciousness, right? But I think we have some steps to take to get to that kind of utopian place that he's at. And I don't know if exceptionalism is the right way to do that or not. But I think that it might be a frame that people can walk through to get to where he's at. He's way far ahead of where the culture is, man. He is way far ahead, and I admire him. I mean, I'm kind of at that same place too, and you know, but that was Jerry Garcia's philosophy, and look what happened to him. So, you know, you got to be careful with everything, right? Even Cali Sober, you got to be careful. We want people to stay alive. And so the other part of what you were asking me about, gosh, what was it? Remind me.
It's like, you know, is Cali Sober just like a harm reduction approach to drugs, or is it a whole lifestyle? You know, like, is there a spiritual element?
Yeah, I think Cali Sober really is a lifestyle. I don't think it's merely a harm reduction approach to intoxicants. When that's why I like the word Cali in there. Mm-hmm. Because when we, like you said, when we think of Cali, we don't simply think of people smoking weed. We think of surfers. We think of Ram Dass. We think of meditation. We think of yoga. We think of Esalen. We think of
vegetariansism.
And all of these things, you know, California did a brilliant thing by creating a state that attracted all these free thinkers. And then all these free thinkers started examining all these ancient things, you know, vegetarianism, yoga. These are ancient things. A lot of these folks went to India. They came back. They brought these practices with them. They opened up studios. You know, some of those early yoga studios, probably in Laurel Canyon, probably in various little basements, small little things. Nobody paid any attention. Nobody was charging any money. And then they grew from there, you know, and they sort of became operationalized and monetized, if you will, and became better distributed because of that. And now I was in Mississippi on a job recently, and I saw a yoga studio in Mississippi. Last place I would ever expect to find a yoga studio. Well, that's the influence of Cali. That's the California influence happening in Mississippi. And those folks can yell at us all they want to about, you know, being too woke or what have you. But guess who has a yoga studio in their state? And guess who's going to yoga in Mississippi? At least enough folks to support a yoga studio. So it's sort of, this is why I go back to that Trojan horse analogy, right? We do these things in California, not just California, there's other places in the West that do these things. And then they get exported. They get exported out of California. And sometimes that's California people who maybe they grew up in Mississippi and maybe they're going back to Mississippi because their parents are sick and they're yoga teacher now. And so they open up a yoga studio and they don't know what's going to happen. They have no idea if anybody in Mississippi is going to sign up for the yoga class, but they got to take care of their sick parent. And this is what they do. So they put their shingle out and next thing you know, it takes hold. And we've seen that with vegetarianism. We've seen that with meditation. We've seen that with Pilates. We've seen that with Botox and plastic surgery, which I'm not sure that's our most proud export. But you see these things and it's just, and then of course, Silicon Valley cranking out what I would say is less proud things for people to adopt, but that's California, right? And so I do think it's a lot more than just intoxication operating system that people can use to, you know, not get addicted. I think it's a whole lifestyle and an entire practice. You know, I meditate every day. I exercise every day. I have relationships with spirit. I pray every single day. I go to therapy, you know. I've lived a stressful life. It's good for me to go to therapy. And I have all these different healers. I have an astrologer. Talk about California, an astrologer. And so I'm like the quintessential one of these people, right? And I also take cannabis pretty much every day of my life and psychedelics on occasion. not as often as when I was younger, but still several times a year. And it's really kept me, I live a very productive life, very happy, productive life, but it's not without effort. All these things are a lot of work. I'll go, sometimes the thing I sometimes hate most is going to see my shrink. It's like really hard work. Or going to meditate when you're like, okay, can I increase my meditation from 20 to 25 minutes today? Well, that extra 5 minutes is a killer. It's really hard. And so there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this work also. It's not easy being human in the modern world. And we need more than one tool in the toolbox. And when people get addicted, it's because they're turning to one tool, and that is some type of self-medication to fill the hole that's inside them or to fill the pain that's inside them. And what we really need as human beings is a lot more tools, and particularly other human beings. We're social creatures, and when we get strung out, we become very isolated and cut off from our families, cut off from our circle of friends. And when you do things like yoga and meditation and vegetarianism and cannabis, these things sort of facilitate community and spending time with friends and spending time with family. And these are our social networks are the things that really are going to keep us alive the longest.
So you mentioned some, a few things about your own spiritual practice. You said you meditate, you pray, you go to therapy, whatever. How much of that is informed by your relationship to these altered states? Just kind of give me like a snapshot day in the life of what your kind of personal spiritual practice is. Just kind of soberly with yourself, but also like, again, inspired, if it is inspired by experiences that you've had.
Oh, absolutely. Every spiritual practice I had has been inspired by psychedelics. When I was a very young man, I don't know, 22 or 23, I had a mystical experience under the influence of mescaline. And during that experience, I basically met Jesus and the Buddha and Muhammad and all my ancestors and all of the people that were both living in the past, future, and present in my life that I loved and I was connected to. And that experience is what was my first step on a spiritual practice. So having a mystical experience under psychedelics is what gave me faith in something that's not atheism or agnostic. That's when I knew there was something going on that was intelligent design, I guess you could say. Not to co-opt a evil right-wing term, but it's. I don't want to call it God or Jesus or anything like that because I don't have a denomination relationship. I don't have any religion. Is not something I'm to, but I do. I wake up in the morning. The first thing I do is I go in my backyard. I thank the universe for another day. I try to just spend 5 or 10 minutes connecting with the nature I have in my backyard. Then I start my exercise, meditation, and prayer routine, which takes a couple hours. And sometimes I do my own meditations without a guided meditation. Sometimes I do a guided meditation. And meditation for me is like a small acid trip or a small psilocybin trip. It's kind of like a trip without any intoxicants. So, I go very deeply inside myself. And, I believe that the entire universe is contained within all of us. In every cell of our bodies, the entire universe lives there. And so I just try to tap into that. And sometimes I use a guide, sometimes I don't. And, meditation, tapping into spirit with meditation and prayer is a much different thing than doing it with psychedelics. But I find for me, I have to slow down. My mind moves too fast and I get in my head too much. So slowing down, getting into my breathing, getting into my body with exercise, getting into, I do a little Tai Chi too as part of it, because I get restless sometimes sitting still. And it's just a way of trying to understand that my time is precious on this earth. Every day is a gift. And I have to understand that I'm part of the universe, and I'm going to go home to that place we all go to after we die, and try to tap into that a little bit, so I can every single day, so that I can act with more mindfulness, with more kindness, with more compassion, not just to others, but to myself. I think a lot of people in our community beat ourselves up a lot. We're really hard on ourselves because we're still in an alternative place, and we're still trying to bring this to the world in a good way. So I think a lot of us are hard on ourselves. So these practices have allowed me to lighten up a lot and to sort of live, and practice more patience, and understand that to get really big things done in the world is hard. It takes time. It takes a lot of other people. Sometimes you're unable to do it. Sometimes you fail. But other times you just have to apply yourself and realize that something you thought might take a year or two might take 5 or 10. These changing, we're trying to re-choreograph society. We're trying to create a whole new pattern in society, going from, brutally greedy capitalism to conscious capitalism. That's not a little tiny shift. That is a complete, utter transformation. And every single person on earth is going to have to alter their behavior in pretty serious ways, in ways we are not going to like, in ways that we're going to hate, in ways that we're going to resist. But we are going to have to do that. And so that's what these practices have allowed me to accept, that I'm going to have to do that, and allow myself to do that work with a little bit more lightness, not take it so seriously, and understand, tomorrow's another day, and, we'll get another chance to advance our mission another day. And it's multi-generational. I'm not going to get it all done in my lifetime. On my deathbed, I'm going to be like, well, this is where I started, this is where I ended, and now there's a whole bunch of people coming up behind me that are going to have to continue the job, people like you. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that, because the new generations coming up behind people like me and my brother, I'm very impressed with these leaders, and I'm super smart people, and it gives me hope that we will be able to create conscious capitalism, and despite how hard it's going to be, and despite how much personal sacrifices we're all going to need to make to get there.
And, as you're saying this, I'm thinking some might even argue conscious capitalism isn't going far enough. And again, the people in the psychedelic space especially kind of are all over the board, whether capitalism is the framework. But, kind of going back, and to bring the conversation full circle, as you're talking about your spiritual practice, how you've been influenced by psychedelics and cannabis. So, how does your spiritual practice really enable you to then take action in the world as an activist? Again, what is the point of a spiritual practice if we're not just being better, more functional, more aware, conscious people who are then utilizing that consciousness for a greater good, right? Who cares if we're settled and at peace? That to an extent can be kind of masturbatory, if it's not having then a positive effect outside ourselves. So yeah, that's my question.
Well, I think it's the hardest part of all this, because spiritual connection came to me late in life. I was well into my 20s when I had that mystical experience. And so I already had a lot of patterns established in my mind about driving forward and perhaps not being as mindful and being attached to my own politics and my own ideologies. And so I think it's the really hardest thing to do. I think it's, for me, I've always been very kind and compassionate to others. I have not been as kind and compassionate to myself. So that's sort of the journey I'm on now. If I can be kind and compassionate to myself, I can create more mindfulness in the interactions I have with others, and to make sure that I do things like set good boundaries with folks, and to just have a very tight moral compass. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who want to work with me that I won't work with because it just is not the right fit from a values standpoint. Some of those jobs are very lucrative jobs.
What are some of those values that you're kind of judging people in regard to?
Well, again, I'm looking for clients and collaborators that want to do something more than just transact and make money. That there's a conscious element to what they're doing. And yeah, I couldn't agree with some people in the community. You know, capitalism itself might be the problem, and there's no, so let's throw the whole thing out. Again, it's like Carl Hart wants us all to be in this place he's in, but we need to kind of get there. And maybe conscious capitalism is the way we get to deciding that capitalism isn't the right ism anymore. Mm-hmm. But I like trading things. I mean, I've been trading things my whole life. I like to trade. I like to trade things. So, you know, the idea of not being able to trade things doesn't feel right to me either. It seems like that's how human beings exchange goods and services. But certainly, hey man, if there's something beyond capitalism that's going to work better, let's do it. Let's lean into it. Let's do it. So, you know, I think that mindfulness and aligning oneself with one's own values and having faith that you don't have to work with people who don't align with your values, and they don't have to align with all your values. A lot of my clients are conservative Republicans. Doesn't mean I don't want to work with them. If they're kind people, if they're generous people, if I know how to connect with them, I don't have to have the same political philosophy as them, but I do need to know that they care about something else besides just a transaction or just making money. And they do. And so I can work with that. That's an opening that I can, again, try to drive that Trojan horse through, mm-hmm. and create some transformative effects with people and you know, and try to get them to practice conscious capitalism or practice something that is a little bit step forward from what they've practiced in the past, a little bit more mindful, a little bit more community oriented, a little bit more giving back, a little bit more knowing that we're all connected in the web of life, and that it's important that we nurture those connections.
And so, you know, based on what you're describing, where do you say the cannabis industry is at with kind of exemplifying these values? Like,
I think we're in I think the battle for the soul of the cannabis industry is raging right now. I just hosted a panel at the big MJ Biz convention in Vegas called Clash of the Titans: Can Cannabis Culture and Big Business Coexist? And I had the CEO from Curaleaf, which is the biggest company in America. I had the COO from Air Wellness, another multi-state operator. I had Swami from Swami Select. I had Vladimir from Happy Monkey. So I had some OG people, and I had some people that aren't even licensed yet that are still selling weed underground on the same panel, or the gray area, I should say, not underground.
The traditional market is, I think, what they're calling it now.
Yeah. Yeah, I call it the traditional underground market, but there's also these gray areas now in these frameworks like New York. And we had a great conversation. It was only a 45-minute conversation. We need to have a lot more of these conversations. But you know, that is an example of trying to bring these communities together.
And was there any sort of takeaway from that conversation that could be just
there was consensus that everyone needs to do more.
Yeah.
And you know, the big companies that were represented there, they do have some incubation programs. They do have community programs. They are giving back. They are putting their money where their mouth is. Is it enough? Are they doing enough? You know, that's where we didn't agree as much. And I, you know, one of the things I'm hoping to do is continue this conversation. I don't know if it's going to be a talk show or a podcast or more panels at more conferences, but you know, if these two communities don't come together, there's going to be a war of mutually assured destruction that is fought between them, and so I'm really trying to avoid that. The psychedelic community, I hope, is seeing the writing on the wall. But to answer your question, the cannabis industry is very far off right now from conscious capitalism. MJ Biz just did their diversity report, and it was dismal. Our industry has less women ownership than mainstream capitalism does. Our industry has less minority ownership or black and brown ownership. I don't want to call it minority, black and brown ownership than mainstream businesses do. Okay. And mainstream businesses suck.
Right.
And we can't even do better than them.
That's surprising, because when cannabis first started going legal, women were actually, there was more women in leadership positions than now.
Yes, but it's declined in the last 2 years. Now, I think the pandemic had something to do with that. We lost women in our workforce, just like many workforces lost women with the pandemic and caregiving, and not enough support for those women in our society, not enough safety nets. So I think that may have played an impact, but I think, you know, what else is going on in our industry is the investors are asserting themselves. They're taking over these companies. Happened with my company. My company, Harborside, had a hostile takeover about a year ago. Before that hostile takeover, we had women of color on our board. We had more than one woman on our board. One was a woman of color. I think we had 3 out of 5 people on the board were women. Hostile takeover, all white men now. All white men now. So, which totally perverted the history of Harborside being a diverse organization. At one time, Harborside, every single manager we had in the company was a woman.
Wow. Okay,
and many women of color, black women, Asian women, Hispanic women. And now we're in Oakland, a very diverse town, but still we made a strong effort in that. And so our little company, just that example, and all these hostile takeovers have happened all over the industry. You read about the churn, you read about it. And these investors, they're used to white guys running stuff. That's what they're used to. So they get rid of the legacy people. They get rid of the women. They get rid of the black and brown people, and they replace them with their Ivy League friends. And
with their own networks. And what happened with Harborside feels like a microcosm of what happened to the cannabis industry in general. And honestly, what I'm seeing, sadly, as you know, what's starting to happen with the psychedelic space, you know, and it's just people who had legacy kind of values, activist values, something even a little bit punk about it, right? Like, you've been doing something that's been so underground for so long that there's an opposition to authority and opposition to the government, and now culturally is being co-opted by people for whom the dominant paradigm of just regular corporate capitalism works. And so the people who maybe saw a chance within cannabis to do things different, to do things within the spirit of the medicine, of the plant, it's just, I mean, it really breaks my heart. You know, I also grew up in the cannabis space, and, you know, remember when weed felt more cool. And for lack of a better term, it felt like there was something different going on. And now, I mean, I think the fact that there are big business conferences in Las Vegas happening, both with cannabis and I think recently actually with psychedelics as well, just speaks to that kind of larger cultural shift and what, I hope conversations like this are really going to, could maybe put a dent in, or at least kind of like cause people to question like this overt, absurd commercialization of things that, don't necessarily always lend themselves to that kind of economic structure.
Yeah, that's why I say the battle of the soul of the cannabis industry is on, and it's a new form of activism for us, right? If you look at New York, the frameworks in New York, the activists learned a lot there, and the frameworks are much better for our community there. And I'm hopeful it doesn't get corrupted and all effed up like things in New York tend to do. But I'm very hopeful. New Mexico, much better framework for our community there. So the activists are learning how to influence politics in such a way that the politicians say, hey, you're right. We can't just give this all to capitalism. We have to make sure that we take care of the people that were most harmed by the war on drugs. So I think it's just another front of activism for us. And we weren't real good at it a few years. We certainly weren't good at it out here in California. The framework's terrible. And we made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes as an activist and put far too much trust in the Democratic Party in California, which has a supermajority, which could fix all this overnight if they wanted to. They just don't want to. And I was naive. I thought that those folks would work with us. They're not working with us. They're working against us, and they're working for the big capitalism guys. And they actually want the legacy farmers and some of these folks that carry the plant for a long time. They want them to die. They want them to be extinct. They don't want them in the market. If they wanted it in the market, they could do so much to help them, but they don't. It's appalling. It really is appalling. So that's sort of the next wave of activism that we're all faced with. Certainly in the psychedelic community, do that activism now before it gets too out of hand. Right now, you have a chance to nip some of this in the bud because none of these compounds are legal yet. They're not being distributed yet. They're very much in the speculative part. I wish the whole thing was nonprofit. If you made the entire psychedelic supply chain and the whole thing that's going on with psychedelics nonprofit, it would all go away. And people like MAPS could just do their thing. Now, when I talked to Rick Doblin about that, he's like, nah, you're not right, Andrew, because it won't happen fast enough that way. We're going to have the for-profit and the nonprofit competing with each other. And we're just going to have to outcompete them in the nonprofit way. Rick's a lot smarter with respect to psychedelic policy than I am. I've been sort of stuck on the cannabis side of the ledger. So I trust Rick, and so maybe he's right about that. But I certainly hope that what's happening in cannabis does not happen in psychedelics. I certainly hope it's a different outcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we see with the decriminalization measures that, you can immediately decriminalize psychedelics. You don't have to have the FDA involved immediately. And that is a way to grant immediate access for people who, aren't necessarily going to be able to afford it or get the right prescriptions or go through all the protocols that the FDA is going to require for MDMA or for synthetic psilocybin or whatever. And, it'll be interesting specifically to watch what's going on with psilocybin, especially because the psilocybin route to FDA approval is right now there's a two-pronged approach. One is being led by USONA, which is a nonprofit, and the other one is being led by Compass Pathways, which is for-profit. And so that, I think, will really elucidate, the pros and cons of a nonprofit versus for-profit approach. MAPS is a little bit different because they're a B Corp. So again, there's a lot to say about psychedelic business models and so forth. But is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to add or just discuss or just, bring to light?
Well, no, we covered a lot of ground. I would just say that I hope that one of the things you did today, I hope will keep happening in our two communities. The psychedelic community and the cannabis community need to be talking and need to be learning from each other. And I hope cross-pollinating more and more. And in a good way. I'm sure there's people in cannabis making moves, transactional moves in psychedelics that aren't real fun for people in that community to see. But I hope the authentic folks that are really trying to make this about and for the people will continue to talk like we have and continue to share notes and continue to figure out ways to collaborate so that the frameworks, it all comes down to the legal frameworks, and we've seen how they influence outcomes so much. So I really appreciate you having me on, and thank you for doing this podcast.
Of course, and thank you for doing all the work that you do. So how can people find you? Like online, social media, whatever? How can they just keep up with what you're doing?
LastPrisonerProject.org is the nonprofit for cannabis prisoner release. I also have a website, AndrewDeAngelo.com, if you're interested in reaching out to me for media or for consulting work. Those are the two best ways to get a hold of me.
All right, great. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. And this conversation will be continued in some format down the line as well. So thank you.